Before we start, I need you to think about the last time you walked through a part of your city that just felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong, not sketchy wrong, just off. Like the air in that particular alley or underpass or dead end street was slightly thicker than it should be. Like something in your hindbrain, the old part, the part that remembers being small and slow and edible, said, "Pay attention." Maybe you looked around and saw nothing. Maybe you kept walking and told yourself it was nothing. But maybe, if you looked at the walls, you would have seen a key. Not a real one. Painted, sprayed, scratched, ancient in design, modern in execution. And if you knew what it meant, you'd understand that the wrongness you felt wasn't a glitch, it was a feature. Tonight, we follow the key. Don't say I didn't warn you. Welcome to the Phantom Navigator, the podcast where we take the dark and the ancient, the genuinely unsettling, and hold it up to the light long enough to figure out why it followed us home. I'm your host. I do this because someone has to, and apparently that someone is me, which tells you everything you need to know about my decision making. Tonight's episode is one I've been building towards for a while. It started with a photograph. Someone sent it to me. No context, just an image. A section of wall, somewhere in Europe. Covered in layered street art, and in the middle of it all, unmistakable, was a key. Old in design, almost ornate. And around it, a wheel. A specific wheel, one you wouldn't recognize unless you'd seen it before, unless you'd gone looking. I went looking. 3 weeks and a genuine alarming amount of research later, here we are. Tonight we're talking about Hecate, one of the oldest, strangest, and most persistently relevant goddesses in the ancient world ever produced. We're talking about her key showing up on city walls from Athens to Buenos Aires to Detroit. We're talking about urban witchcraft, psychogeographic ritual, surveillance resistance, and a theory. The genuinely compelling theory that the human subconscious is trying to tell us something by reaching 3,000 years backwards and spray painting it onto a wall. We're going historical. We're going conspiratorial. We're going places that probably have something painted on the walls that you should probably read before you walk through. Get comfortable. This one goes deep. Let's start at the beginning, which for Hecate is a very long time ago, and also, depending on your framework, possibly right now. Hecate is one of the most ancient divine figures in the Western esoteric tradition. We're talking pre-classical, before the Olympic pantheon got organized and branded and turned into mythology you learn in school with the fun stories about Zeus doing things he absolutely should not have been doing. Hecate predates the cleanup. She's older than the narrative. And that age matters because it means that she survived things that most gods didn't. Her origins are generally debated. Some scholars trace her to pre-Greek Anatolia, modern Turkey, where she may have begun as a regional goddess of the wilderness and night before being absorbed into the Greek pantheon. Others connected her to earlier Thracian traditions. What's interesting is that she was never entirely domesticated. Even when she was officially part of the Greek religious system, she operated outside of it. She lived in the edges, the thresholds, the place where the official story ended and the real one began. In Hesiod's Theo- Theogony, one of the oldest Greek texts we have written around 700 BCE, Hecate gets a remarkably lengthy and respectful passage. Hesiod calls her one of the most honored of all gods. Zeus himself, he says, gave her dominion over earth, sea, and sky. She was not a minor goddess, she was not a niche figure, she was foundational, and then gradually she got reassigned. By the classical period, the Athens of Plato and Socrates, the Greece most people picture, Hecate had become more specifically the goddess of magic, the night, ghosts, and crossroads. She was triple forms, three bodies, or one body with three faces, depending on the source, each facing different directions. Her statues, Hecataea, stood at three-way crossroads and city gates throughout the ancient world. And here's a detail I want you to sit with for a moment. Every household in ancient Athens had a small Hecateon, a shrine to Hecate, at the front door. Not inside, not on the altar with the household gods, at the door, at the threshold. Because Hecate was understood to be the guardian of the liminal, the space between inside and outside, between the known and the unknown, between the safe world of the home and whatever was out there in the dark. She held torches, she held a knife, and she held keys. Always keys. And I want to pause here for a second because I think this detail gets lost when people talk about Hecate. She is almost always described first in terms of her darkness, the ghosts, the magic, the night, the association with Medea and Circe, and the scarier end of Greek mythology. And yes, fine, she is absolutely the goddess you call when you want to do something that polite society would rather you didn't. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the keys, that's the part that I find most interesting. Because the keys are not a passive symbol, a torch lights your way, a knife protects, but a key means access. It means there are doors, and she decides who gets to go through them. It means there's knowledge, and she is the one holding the mechanism by which it's unlocking. Hecate isn't just a guardian of dark places, she's a curator of them. She decides what you're allowed to know, she decides when the door opens. And now her keys are on your city walls. That's not nothing. Let me give you the stories because the symbols doesn't make sense without the mythology. And a mythology is genuinely wild. This is the most people have some version of. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, is abducted by Hades and dragged into the underworld. Demeter loses her mind with grief, and the world goes barren. Classic myth. You've heard it. But here's the part that gets cut from the simplified version. When Demeter goes searching for her daughter, when she is wandering the earth, half mad, torches in hand, looking for any sign of what happened, Hecate is the one who appears to her. Hecate is the one who says, I heard her crying. I don't know who took her, but I heard her. And it is Hecate who accompanies Demeter to the sun god Helios, who finally tells them the truth. After Persephone is eventually retrieved, partially because the pomegranate seeds, because, of course, it is Hecate who becomes her companion in the underworld during the months that she must return there each year. Hecate is the psychopomp who makes the tradition survivable. She walks between the world so others don't have to walk alone. She is, in this story, not a figure of horror. She is the first responder. She shows up in the dark with a light and says, I know this place. Follow me. Here's something that almost never makes it into the mythology roundups. The Hecate Suppers. On the last day of each lunar month, the dark of the moon, when the sky was completely black, ancient Greeks would leave offerings at three-way crossroads for Hecate. These were called left.Hecates, Hecate's dinners. Food, eggs, fish, sometimes small dog sacrifices, honey, and garlic. Left at the intersection. Not taken back, left for Hecate and, by extension, the spirits of the restless dead that were believed to follow her in train. This is a monthly ritual, regular as a calendar event. And who performed it? Not priests in temples, ordinary people, households. The same people who had her shrine at the foot door. Hecate was not a distant divine figure. She was a constant presence in daily Greek life, specifically the moments of transition and danger. The three-way crossroads was chosen because three roads meeting creates a point with no center. You couldn't stand at a three-way crossroads without standing in the margin between all three directions. There was no safe, committed position. You were always technically in between. That's where Hecate lived, in the in between. And I need to point something out here, because once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. The monthly ritual at the crossroads, the food left out, the acknowledgement that the dark of the moon is a liminal time, this is not a practice that died with ancient Greece. You can find versions of this adapted and evolved in voodoo, in candomblé, in hoodoo, in various European folk magic traditions, and modern neo-pagan practice. The form changes, the function doesn't. Humans, across thousands of years and dozens of unconnected cultures, keep arriving at the same instinct. At the crossing point, at the dark of the month, leave something. Acknowledge what lives in the in-between. Either there's something in the in-between that responds to acknowledgement, or there's something in the human brain that needs to make this gesture. I generally cannot tell you which is more interesting. We need to talk about the wheel, because you're going to see it on the walls alongside the keys, and you need to know what you're looking at. The Strophalos, Hecate's wheel, is one of the most visually distinctive symbols in the Western occult tradition. It's a wheel with a serpentine pattern and its center, labyrinth with six-fold symmetry, ancient in origin. It appears in the Chaldean oracles, a collection of mystical texts from the 2nd century CE, written in hexameter verse and attributed to divine revelation, as symbol of Hecate's cosmic power. The name literally means spinning top or whirling thing. And it was used as an implement in certain ancient rites. A wheel on a cord spun to produce a humming sound, used to call spirits or divine presence. The labyrinth center of the symbol is significant. It's a path that both leads inward and leads out. It's a symbol of navigation through confusion, a map for the unmappable. Its modern resurgence, and this is documented, spiked in the late 20th century as Wicca and neo-paganism grew as organized movements, and then spiked again in the 2010s. As the internet gave previously isolated practitioners a way to find each other and share visual language. By the time it started appearing in street art in significant numbers, it had accumulated centuries of layered meaning. When you see the strophalos next to the key on a city wall, you're looking at a combination that in esoteric shorthand means something like this. There is a threshold, and the one who navigates it, the one who holds the key, is Hecate. It's a signature, an identifier, and it is, in certain initiated circles, a beacon. A marker left for those who know what they're looking for. Which raises the question, who leaves them? And who are they leaving them for? We're gonna get there, but first, let's follow the symbol out of the symbol out of the ancient world and into the city. The leap from ancient shrine to modern spray paint is not as dramatic as it sounds if you follow the thread. Hecate never fully disappeared. That's the important thing to understand. She went underground. Sometimes literally, but she persisted in the Western esoteric traditions through the centuries in ways that most mainstream histories don't acknowledge. In the medieval period, as Christianity restructured European religious life, the crossroad goddess didn't vanish, she transformed. The crossroads became associated with the devil worship, meaning at midnight, crossroads were features of witch trial testimony throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The figure at the crossroads went from a goddess to devil, but the location stayed the same. The crossroads remained the liminal point, the in-between, place where prohibited knowledge was exchanged. The witch, standing at the crossroads, was, in folk imagination, doing the same thing as the ancient Greek household was doing on the dark of the moon, acknowledging the power of the threshold, making an offering, asking for access. She survived in Shakespeare's Hecate appeared in Macbeth, written in scenes that scholars believe were added by a different writer, Thomas Middleton. But she was there, directing the witches, furious that they've been meddling in fate without her permission. She's not a set dressing, she's the authority, the one who controls the terms of the bargain. She survived a Renaissance ceremonial magic in grimoires and magical texts that circulated in manuscript form through networks of scholars, physicians, and court magicians. The Greek magical papyri, a collection of texts from Greco-Roman Egypt, spanning through 100 BCE to 400 CE, contains numerous invocations of Hecate, detailed and specific, describing her physical appearance, her powers, and the precise ritual conditions under which she could be contacted. These texts were rediscovered by Western scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries. They fed into the great occult revival of the Victorian era, the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, the explosion of organized esoteric practice in the late 1800s. Hecate was present in all of it. And then the 20th century happened. And the counterculture and Wicca and neo-paganism and the internet. And suddenly a goddess who survives by traveling underground through scholarly networks and secret societies was available to anyone with a search engine and a genuine question. The resurgence isn't random, it's the latest chapter in a very long story. Here's the thing that nobody says out loud but find compelling to the point of minor obsession. Hecate has one of the most consistent survival records of any figure in the Western supernatural tradition. She is persistently, almost stubbornly present across 3,000 years of history. You can trace her from the Hesiod to the Greek magical papyri, or to medieval witch trials, to Shakespeare, to the Golden Dawn, to a wall in Detroit in 2019. And the symbol is recognizable at every point. The key, the torches, the crossroads, the triple form. Most ancient gods did not survive this way. Most were absorbed, replaced, forgotten, or turned into folklore characters drained of their original weight. Hecate kept her weight, she kept her specific function, she kept her keys. Either this is a testament to the extraordinary staying power of genuine, useful, archetypal symbol, or I'm not saying this, I'm just saying this. She's been maintaining her own brand image for 3 millennia, and we're all collectively her marketing department. I'm not ruling anything out. Let's get concrete. Literally. I want you I want you to take I want to take you through some documented cases, specific cities, specific contexts, where Hecate's symbols have appeared in urban environments, because I think the where is just as important as the what. Let's start with the obvious one, Athens, where Hecate had her shrines at every gate, at every major crossroads, at every front door, the original city of her prominence. Contemporary Athens has street art culture that is, by any measure, extraordinary. The years of financial crisis and austerity that Greece experienced starting in 2009 produced a wave of politically charged, aesthetically sophisticated urban art that turned entire neighborhoods, Exarchella in particular, into open air galleries of resistance and grief and rage. In that context, Hecate's imagery began appearing not as nostalgia, not as classical decoration, but as active symbols. Her keys, her wheel, on the walls of a city that was itself in a state of violent transition, a city at its own crossroads. Exarchella, if you're not familiar, is Athens' anarchist neighborhoods. It has been a site of political resistance since the 1970s, home to a student uprising in 1973 that contributed to the fall of the Greek military junta. It is, in every sense, a liminal zone, a place that exists in the gap between what the state wants and what the people in it refuse to accept. And Hecate's symbols are all over those walls. The placement is not coincidental. The people making this art are not making classical references, they are making a claim. This space is a threshold. The old powers still apply here. You've been warned. Berlin is relevant to this conversation in ways that are almost too neat to be real. Berlin is a city that was literally divided, cut in half. A wall running through the middle of it for 28 years, from 1961 to 1989. A city of enforced, violent, and architectural liminality. For nearly 3 decades, the wall itself was a threshold, and one of the most heavily painted surfaces in the world. The western side of the wall was covered in arts. It was a canvas that existed in no man's land between two realities. After reunification, the city that emerged was, and still is, a city defined by transition, by in between spaces. Former East Berlin is full of abandoned buildings, empty lots, liminal infrastructure, and Berlin is one of the most active occult and esoteric communities in Europe. The crossroads in modernity, trauma, and spiritual seeking. Hecate's symbol appears in Berlin with notable frequency in the neighborhood of Kreuzberg and Reichstein, both former edge of the wall zones, both neighborhoods that developed their identities in the in-between. The placement is almost cartographically significant. These are the parts of the city that know their thresholds. New Orleans is, in some ways, the most obvious city for this conversation, and yet the specificity of how it manifests there is generally fascinating. New Orleans has its own crossroad mythology, deeply embedded in voodoo and hoodoo traditions that developed in Louisiana over centuries, blending West African, Caribbean, and European spiritual practices. The crossroads in New Orleans is the domain of Papa Legba, the Iwa who stands at the intersection of the human and spirit worlds, who controls access, who holds the keys to communication between realms. Papa Legba is not Hecate. There's a distinct figures from distant traditions, but the function is identical. The crossroads guardians who control the threshold, who hold the keys, who must acknowledge before the door will open. When Hecate's symbol appears in New Orleans street art, and they do, particularly in the Bywater and Treme neighborhoods, they exist alongside Papa Legba imagery, alongside voodoo reeves, alongs- alongside an entire existing visual language of threshold guardianship. It creates a layering effect. Multiple traditions across centuries arriving at the same walls, all pointing to the same function. The city itself seems to know it's a crossroads. Every wall is a conversation. Detroit dives. Detroit deserves its own extended moments because what happened to Detroit is one of the most dramatic examples of a city becoming involuntarily and entirely a liminal space. At its peak in 1950s, Detroit was one of the most prosperous cities in the United States, population over 1.8 million. The center of American auto industry, a city with a skyline that meant something. Then came deindustrialization, white flight, decades of disinvestment. By 2013, the city filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Population had fallen to around 700,000. Entire neighborhoods have been abandoned. Vast stretches of the city returned to something resembling wilderness, urban prairie crumbling Victorian houses, factories so decayed they looked like ruins from civilization that had ended without warning. And into those spaces came the artists, the urban explorers, the foragers of meaning in abandoned places, and with them, their symbols. Detroit's abandoned spaces, the Packard plant, the Michigan Central Station, before its renovation, the acres of urban prairie on the east side became a kind of pilgrimage site for a particular kind of person. Someone drawn to the threshold, someone who wanted to stand in the gap between what was and what hadn't yet become, and make something into that space. Hecate's keys appeared in Detroit in context of this broader reclamation. On the walls of buildings that had stopped being buildings and hadn't yet become anything else, at the literal crossroads of decay and renovation. And here's the detail that I find generally eerie. When when the Michigan Central Station was being renovated, when the teams went in to document the space before the restoration, they found on specific interior walls symbols of art historians couldn't immediately categorize, layered imagery, keys, wheels, triple form figures left by someone who knew what they were doing in a space that had been inaccessible for decades. Someone was marking the threshold long before anyone came to restore it. I want to sit in Detroit for just a moment longer because I think it illustrates something important. When a city decays, when an infrastructure of daily life collapses, when the streets empty and the buildings fall, and the official map becomes unreliable, what happens to a spiritual geography? Ancient cities had Hecate at every gate, every crossroads, because the city itself was understood to be a living thing with a boundary, a threshold, and inside and outside. What happens when the inside empties out? When the boundary becomes meaningless because there's nothing left to protect? My theory, and this is just me, This is not in any academic paper I've read. Is that condition is that in that condition, the entire city becomes a crossroads. Detroit wasn't a city with thresholds. Detroit became all threshold. An entire urban ecosystem in a liminal state, and the symbols that appeared on the walls were responding to that condition, acknowledging it, marking it, saying, yes, we see what this is. We know what lives here. Whether that's art therapy at a civilization scale or something more literal, I'll leave that up to you. Let's talk about the people leaving offerings. Because in this, because this is real, this is documented, and this is happening in your city. Urban witchcraft, sometimes called city witchcraft, sometimes just urban magic, is a practice that has been developing organically for decades but coincides into recognizable subculture in the 2010s. It's not Wicca, it's not neo-paganism. In a traditional sense, it is something more hybrid, more situational, more responsive in the specific energies of urban environments. The core promise is this: the cities are not spiritually neutral spaces, they have energy. And I use that word in both a metaphorical and literal for practitioner sense. They have history embedded in their geography. They have patterns of human movement and emotion and intention concentrated in their streets and buildings and infrastructure. And those patterns can be worked with, interacted with, influenced. The crossroads, Hecate's domain, is the central operative concept in urban practice. A crossroads is anywhere that paths intersect with significance. A subway interchange, a busy corner, an alleyway that cuts between streets. Any point where the flow of human movements crosses itself, where choices are made, where routes are diverged. And practitioners mark these spaces, sometimes with art, the spray painted keys, the chalk symbols, the stencilized wheels, sometimes with physical offerings left at the base of walls in the city cracks of pavement. Coins. Copper specifically, because copper is associated with Venus and traditional feminine energy, but also because Hecate historically received coins as offerings, dried herbs, rosemary for remembrance, mugwort for psychic opening, lavender for protection, small stones, sometimes food and particularly eggs, which have been associated with Hecate since ancient Greece. An egg is, after all, a threshold object, a boundary between potential and actual, the in between thing. In some cities, there are documented routes, informal paths between practitioners, rarely written down, that map the active Hecate shrines on public walls, places where offerings have been left consistently, where the art has lasted or been renewed longer than similar works elsewhere, where people report, and you can find these accounts in various online communities if you know where to look, a particular quality of atmosphere, a heaviness, a sense of being observed. And I have to tell you about the community aspect of this because it delights me in ways I'm not entirely comfortable with. There are forums, online communities, Discord servers, subreddits, where urban practitioners document these sites, where they share photographs of walls they found marked, ask for help identifying symbols, debated relative power of specific intersections in their cities, where someone will post a picture of an alley and glass glow, or Guadalajara, or Gdansk, and say, "Found this. Has anyone left offerings here before?" And if someone else will respond, "Yes, that corner has been active since at least 2015, I'd recommend mugwort, but stay away from blood offerings. The energy there is specific." This is happening. People are crowdsourcing a living map of Hecate shrines in cities around the world, maintained through street art and small physical offerings, communicated through internet and private messages. It is simultaneously the most ancient and the most contemporary thing I can imagine. A 3,000-year-old practice running on Discord. Hecate, if she exists, must find this absolutely hilarious. Or appropriate. Probably both. Let me tell you about Heka, because this is where the linguistic rabbit hole opens up, and I generally cannot recommend it enough. Hecate's name is connected etymologically, but by scholars who study these things carefully and argue about it productively. In the Egyptian world, Heka, Heka, magic, but specifically magic as a language, magic as the act of speaking things into being. In ancient Egyptian theology, Heka was not a skill or technique. It was a fundamental force in the universe. It was present at creation. It was the mechanism by which the gods themselves had shaped reality, and it was understood to be accessible in limited ways through specific practices to humans. The person who practiced Heka was not doing something supernaturally. They were doing something very natural, operating in alignment with a force that was already present in the structure of things. The instrument of Heka was the tongue, the voice, the word. Now, graffiti, street art, unauthorized text and images inscribed into unauthorized surfaces. What is it? At the most basic level, it is speaking where you are not supposed to speak, writing where you are not supposed to write, using the wall as a throat, passing the city itself as a medium of expression for voices in that city. Official architecture would prefer remained silent. In the framework of Heka, graffiti is a spell. Every tag is casting. Every mural is a ritual. The city wall becomes the instrument through which practitioner speaks into the fabric of the neighborhood, attempting to influence its energy, its identity, its meaning. And when the symbols being cast is Hecate's key, when the spell being spoken is the space is a threshold, and she who holds the keys governs it. Something very specific is being attempted. The street is being consecrated. All right, we've done the history. We've done the mythology. We've walked into cities. Now, we go into the theories that live below the theories. The ones that don't fit in the in the lit review. The ones that feel like they were written into the back of something. I'm going to give you 4. They range from academically respectable to absolutely unhinged. I will clearly label which is which. I will not tell you which ones I personally believe, because that is information you don't need or also none of your business. Let's start with the one that has actual scholarly literature behind it. The philosopher Michael Foucault described the modern state as a panopticon, a structure of surveillance in which the witch can never know when they are being watched, and therefore must behave as if they're being watched always. The panopticon doesn't need to watch you constantly. It just needs you to know it could. Modern cities are increasingly literal panopticons, CCTV cameras, facial recognition, license plate readers, phone tracking, social media monitoring. The, the data trails that follow every movement through digital and physical space. The city watches, the city records, the city uses. Again, this is a tool for escaping the panopticon, not physically. You can't spray paint your way off the grid, but symbolically, psychologically, the keys in the wall says this space has another dimension that camera doesn't capture. The Strophalos says there is a pattern here that the algorithm cannot read. The marking says the night travelers were here, and they are not visible. And that is deliberate. Street art historians who study this describe it as a practice of counter-cartography, making a map of a city that runs parallel to the official one. That includes spaces and the meanings and histories that official cartography erases. The Hecate markings area, the Hecate markings are a counter map, a guide to the city's shadow geography, and the people who can read it, the ones who knows the symbol, own a version of the city that the surveillance apparatus doesn't know exists. That's not nothing. That's actually genuinely threatening to a certain kind of power, which may be why the people doing it rarely announce themselves. Here's a theory that I think about the most. The one that keeps me up in a good way, mostly. We are living through an acceleration. I don't think anyone seriously disputes this anymore. The pace of technological change in the last 20 years has been qualitatively different from anything that came before it. The smartphone arrived in 2017. Social media rewired communication within a decade. AI has, in the last 3 years alone, begun to reshape the landscape of creative work, knowledge work, and the basic question of what it means to be a human producer of meaning. The physical world is being mediated, filtered, and increasingly replaced by digital experience. More of human life happens on screens. More of human relationship is conducted through text and image on glass rectangles. More of what we call reality is technically constructed, filtered, algorithmic, curated, generated. And into this context, ancient symbols spray painted into brick and concrete, demanding a physical presence to be seen, insisting on the primacy of the material. There is a theory articulated by practitioners in esoteric communities and, to a lesser extent, by a certain cultural theorist that human beings, when they feel reality becoming unmoorable, when the ground of the reality begins to feel uncertain, reach instinctively for the most stable anchors that they can find. And few things are more stable than symbols have meant the same thing for 3,000 years. Hecate is the goddess of the in between. She governs transition. She exists in the gap between one state and the next. If humanity is in transition, a genuine civilization, what comes after this transition? Then her resurgence is not surprising. It is, in this reading, appropriate. It is the collective, subconscious recognizing the conditions and reaching for the right tool. The person who is spray paints a Hecate key on a wall may not consciously think I am performing a 3,000-year-old apotropaic rite to manage the anxiety of civilizational transition. They may just feel in their bones that the shape is right, that the belongings on the walls, that something in them needed to be put there. Jung called this collective unconscious the layer of human psyche that operates below individual experience that contains the deep patterns, the archetypes that reoccur across culture and time because they are responding to something constant in the human condition. Hecate is a crossroads archetype, and we are the crossroads. The keys are symptoms, a signal, or something that has no better language than the ancient symbol and a can of spray paint. This is the one where I lose a certain percentage of the audience, and that is okay. Because the people who stay for this part are the right people. What if it's not spontaneous, parallel, unconnected cultural phenomenon? What if the appearance of Hecate's symbols across cities on multiple continents is, at least particularly, coordinated? Not in a shadowy, conspiracy, New World Order way, something much more interesting and much more plausible. The Western esoteric traditions have always had a initiatory networks, groups of practitioners who share knowledge, practices, and visual languages that are not publicly advertised, whose communication is deliberately indirect, symbolic rather than literal. The leaving of a specific symbol in a specific location, readable only to those who know the visual language, is a practice with a very long history in these traditions. It's not graffiti in the tagging sense, it's closer to a dead drop, a message left for a visible but unreadable form. The Strophalos, specifically Hecate's wheel, is a recognized symbol in several currents of initiated Western occultism. Organizations exist, real organizations with real memberships that I will not name because I have some sense of self-preservation, for whom this symbol has specific initiatory meaning. For whom appearances in a public space is communication, is every Hecate key left by an initiate? No, absolutely not. The symbol has been sufficiently widely dis- disseminated through internet culture, neo-paganism, and occult aesthetics that plenty of people use it without knowing the full context but a pattern. The specific combination of key and strat- Strophilos in specific types of locations at specific scales that may not be entirely spontaneous. I'm not saying there's a secret society of occultists spray painting ancient divine symbols onto city walls to communicate across urban networks in plain sight, but I'm also not saying there isn't. And here's the last one. The last one I made up and I can't really stop believing. What if the question is wrong? What if we've been asking why is Hecate appearing in cities now? When the correct question is why are people noticing Hecate in cities now? Think about it. The crossroads have always been the crossroads. The thresholds have always been the thresholds. Every city in history has had its non places as liminal zones, its alleyways and underpasses and abandoned lots where official narrative of the city breaks down. These spaces have always existed, and then they have always had a quality that humans consistently described as the same terms: heaviness, watchfulness, the sense of being in between. What if Hecate, or whatever Hecate is, whatever force or pattern or reality that figure represents, has always been present in those spaces? What if the crossroads have always been held by something that the crossroad goddess points towards? And what we're seeing is not an arrival, but a recognition. The street art isn't summoning anything, it's naming something that was already there. The key isn't unlocking a door that was locked. It's pointing at a door that was always open, in a wall most people were trained not to look at. The artists who make these marks, the practitioners who leave the offerings, the people who feel the weight of certain alleyways and don't walk past them quickly enough, they are not doing something novel, they are doing something very old. They are looking at the walls of the city and seeing what the walls have always contained. The city is the shrine. It always was. We just forgot to look at the walls. Let's spend some real time with the wheel, because I've mentioned it several times and I don't think I've done justice to how strange it is. The Strophilos of Hecate is documented most substantially in the Chaldean oracles. A text I want to spend a moment on because it's one of the most fascinating documents in the Western esoteric tradition, and almost nobody outside the scholarly and occult circles have heard of it. The Chaldean oracles are a collection of hexameter verses, 226 fragments, give or take, compiled and possibly written in the 2nd century CE by a man named Julian the Theurge, and possibly his father Julian the Chaldean. Their origin claimed to be divine, dictated by the gods themselves, specifically by Hecate, through a process of spiritual contact. Whether you find that credible is your business. What's notable is that these texts were treated as sacred sculpture by Neoplatonist philosophers. Porphyr, Labsicius, Pro- Proclus, people who were among the most sophisticated thinkers of the late ancient world, and they were read, studied, and commented on for centuries. They described a cosmological system in which Hecate occupies a central position, not as an underworld goddess, not as a witch's patron, but as a cosmic power, the soul of the world, the animating force of matter, the world soul that connects the transcendent source of all beings to the material world we inhabit. In this framework, the Strophilos, the spinning wheel, is a mechanism by which the connection operates. It is the active principle of Hecate's cosmic function. It spins. It creates a pattern. It creates a patterning of its material world. It is, in the system of oracles, the symbol not of darkness, but the force that makes the world cohere. That's a symbol showing up on your city walls, not a sigil of darkness, not a mark of transgression. The symbol of the force that makes things cohere. Given the current state of things, I'll let you interpret that however feels most accurate to you right now. I would say that's a fairly pointed choice. There is also the physical object, the actual spinning top of on a cord, the instruments, because the details matter. Strophilos was used in ritual as a sound-making device, spun at speed. It produced a humming, whirling noise, and in ancient magical practice, the sound was understood to be a calling card, a frequency that opens something. Modern practitioners, urban ones included, sometimes use various variations of this, humming throat tones, frequencies produced in specific locations as part of the marking practice. The idea that a certain sound in certain spaces interact with the energy of those spaces in ways that shift their character. In this physics, is it psychology? Is it something else entirely? I'm not going to let that sit there without an answer because I think the question is more interesting than any answer I couldn't currently give you. Let's return to Heka, because I started this thread earlier and I want to pull all the way through. Language creates reality. This is not a mystical claim. It is a well-documented cognitive cognitive, and a social one. The words we use to describe spaces change how we experience them. The names we give to the streets, neighborhoods, landmarks, they shape the identity of those places or the people who use them. Hecate takes this further. Hecate says language doesn't just describe reality, it participates in reality. It changes things. The spoken word, the written word, the inscribed symbol. These are not neutral. They are acts with effects. Graffiti operates in exactly this space. The most basic graffiti, the tag, the writer's name sprayed in stylized letters, is an act of inscription, of putting a mark on one's existence into a surface that doesn't officially acknowledge that existence. It's saying, I was here. This is real. I am real. In the context of urban environments that render certain people invisible, that refuse to see certain populations, certain uses of space, certain modes of being, the inscription is an assertion. It speaks into indifference of the city. When the inscription carries a specific symbol, especially one loaded with accumulated meaning of Hecate's imagery, it's more specific speech act. It's not just I was here. It's I was here and I named what this place is. And the name I gave it is older than a city and will outlast it. The wall becomes a mouth. The symbol is the word. And here's the thing about words. In Hecate tradition, they don't expire. An inscription in an ancient Egyptian temple still carries something of its original intention. Even now, the magicians of this ancient world took very seriously the idea that properly made inscription could outlast the physical materials it was written on, that it continued to operate to exert its influence even after original context have been forgotten. The symbols on city walls in this framework are not ephemeral. Paint over concrete is not permanent, but their function, while they last, is cumulative. Each person who walks past and feels something, even without knowing why, each practitioner who recognizes the symbol and responds to it, each offering left the base of the wall, these interactions accumulate. The space changes. Whether you call that in magic or sociology, the outcome is the same. The wall spoke. Someone heard it. I want to try and paint a picture of who actually does this because I think there's tendency to imagine a very specific archetype. Robes, candles, probably owns too many crystals. And the reality is considerably more interesting and considerably more varied. The people who mark the walls and leave the offerings are not monolith. Some are trained initiates in formal magical orders, organizations with lineages, initiatory degrees, specific practices, real history. For those people, the marking of a liminal urban space is a precise ritual act performed according to specific protocols. The symbol is exact. The placement is deliberate. The timing is often specific. Dark of the moon, certain planetary hours, certain dates on the esoteric calendar. This is ceremonial magic brought into the street. Some are solitary practitioners, people who develop their practice from books, online communities, personal experimentation, who identified with Hecate specifically out of a field of possible divine figures because something in the mythology resonated with their personal experience of being in between identities, between worlds, between what they were and what they were becoming. These practitioners are often younger, often people whose personal history involves navigating the thresholds that mainstream society doesn't acknowledge. The crossroad goddess speaks to people who live at the crossroads. Some are artists first and practitioners second. The practitioners first and artists second, working in tradition of art making that doesn't separate the aesthetic from the spiritual. The painting in the ritual, the complete image, is the outcome. They may not call themselves witches, they might call themselves street artists or muralists, or just people who felt a specific wall needed a specific thing on it. And some, a not insignificant number, are people who don't have a formal practice at all, who found the symbol online or in a tattoo parlor or on a piece of jewelry or in a book, and who felt in that specific way that the symbols sometimes operate, that it belonged to them, that they had already been living in Hecate's domain and just didn't have the name for it yet. These people leave offerings at walls they didn't mark, or mark walls with symbols they've researched but not been initiated into. They're the loose edge of the subculture, the ones that initiated sometimes look at sideways. The ones who historically tend to be the reason traditions survive. What they all share is this: a relationship to a liminality that is not accidental, a comfort with that the between the most people don't have, a willingness to stand in a crossroads in the dark and wait to see what comes. And I want to say, as someone who spent a lot of time in the dark corners of research for this episode, there's something genuinely moving about this. Not in a greeting card kind of way. And you've been staring at the abyss long enough that the abyss has started to feel like a neighborhood way. Hecate's subculture in modern urban form is largely populated by people who are navigating real transitions, real losses, real in-betweens. People who are between genders, between cultures, between countries, between the person that they were raised to be and the person they actually are. People for whom the mainstream symbolic vocabulary of their society doesn't have a word for what they're going through. And they found a 3,000-year-old goddess who specializes in exactly what they're experiencing, who has been waiting at every crossroads for every traveler since before most of the cities we live in existed. There's a reason she's still here. There's a reason the keys keep appearing. The people who need a crossroad guardian, they still out there, probably always be, and Hecate, whatever Hecate is, apparently keeps showing up for them, which is either very comforting or very interesting in what you believe. I find it both. Let me try to bring this together in something you can carry out of this episode. The key, Hecate's key, is a symbol of access, not just doors, to layers, to the understanding that every space has more than one dimension of history, more than one layer of meaning, more than one occupation across time. The city you live in, whatever city that is, has secret history. It has the official history of the founding dates, the architecture timelines, the names of which streets signs, the multiple monuments. But beneath that, layered in streets and walls and a specific geography of the place, is everything else. The people who moved through it before the official story stated. The uses of space that didn't get written down. The tragedies and the ecstasies and the transitions that happened in the alleyways and the crossroads and the liminal zones that never made it into the archive. Hecate's keys on city walls are pointing at that second layer. They're saying the city has a secret history, and if you can read this symbol, you have access to it. Not because the symbol is magical, or not only because the symbol is magical, but because the act of reading it as a threshold, the abandoned lot as a place that was once full of life and will be again, and is right now in a state of sacred in between. The key opens the city itself to its own depth. And the person who can read the walls, who knows what the symbol means, who recognizes the Strophilos, who notices the offerings at the base of mural, the person moves through the city differently. They see what most people walk past. They stand in spaces most people hurry through. They are, in the oldest sense of the term, navigating. Not just the streets, the layers. Here's where we land. Hecate is one of it has been standing at the crossroads for 3,000 years, before Athens was Athens, before the cities were cities, before there were walls to paint. She was the threshold. With her torches and her keys, watching every traveler who stood at the place where roads diverged and had to choose. She survived the decline of Greek world. She survived the rise of Christianity and the witch trials and the centuries of being called a demon when she used to be called a goddess. She survived Enlightenment's attempt to rationalize her out of existence. She survived the digital age attempts to make the physical world irrelevant. And she is, right now, on walls in your city, in the subways, and in the alleyways and the dead zones of the urban infrastructure. In the spaces where the official story breaks down and something older speaks through the concrete. The keys aren't decoration, they're not nostalgia, they're not even quite art. Or not only art. They are a communication from the people who put them there and the people who know how to read them, about the nature of spaces they inhabit, about the city's shadows, geography, about the persistent, unkillable human need to stand at the crossroads and say, I know what this is, I know who holds the keys, and I know what the in between is. I know that the in between is not empty. The in between is not empty. It has never been empty. Hecate is still there. She always was, waiting in the threshold, torches lit, keys in hand, watching every single one of us decide which road to take. The one that goes towards what's safe and known, or the one that goes towards what's dark and real deeper than anything the map can show you. And if you've made it to the end of this episode, if you've been here for all of this, then I think you already know which road you're on. You've been on Hecate's road this whole time. You just had to walk it long enough to see the symbol. She nods. She notes the passage. She turns on one of her three faces, just slightly, towards what comes next. The door, as it happens, was never locked. Welcome to the threshold. This has been the Phantom Navigator. I'm your host. Thank you for walking the dark with me. Stay curious, stay a little bit afraid, and the next time you're in an alleyway that feels wrong, the next time the air is thicker than it should be, and something in your old brain says pay attention, look at the walls. Leave something at the base of the key if you find one. She's probably been waiting for it. We'll see you at the crossroads.